This presentation is going to look at Lauren Alfrey and Twine's 2016 study, Gender Fluid Geek Girls, Negotiating Inequality Regimes in the Tech Industry. The study emphasizes the ways that gender-fluid white and Asian women experience workplace advantages in the male-dominated industry as compared to Black women with similar gender and sexual identities. They also look at how STEM disciplines are historically known for isolating women, and with the growth of San Francisco as the biggest tech hub in the nation, the industry continues to illuminate a predominantly white male culture. As noted by Alfrey and Twine, gender scholars have looked at three main ways women approach this culture. They downplay their femininity, they neutralize their gender difference through discursive positioning, and/or they leave work in the STEM fields altogether, a pattern referred to by scholars as the leaky pipeline. Alfrey and Twine use their resources to introduce this study, which highlights the ways these three components are played out in the Silicon Valley and the greater San Francisco area through profiles of women in the industry who identify as racially diverse and/or present as gender fluid and LGBTQ. Their overall findings indicate that women who belong to the racially dominant groups in the tech industry and who present as gender fluid and identify as LGBTQ are better able to manage their status on male-dominated teams. Black women did not experience the same advantages despite their similar gender identities and performance. Expanding upon Kristen Schilt's study of female-to-male trans men's experience in the workplace, which we looked at earlier, Alfrey and Twine are interested in the ways that non-gender normative women negotiate occupational cultures that privilege heteronormative masculinity. They answered this interest through a study of women who hold jobs as programmers, technical writers, and engineers, occupations that are predominantly led by white or Asian males, especially in San Francisco. Alfrey and Twine spent the better part of about 2 years conducting interviews with women in these fields across a multitude of established and startup tech companies. These included bigger names like Dropbox and Google. The presented study includes data pulled from interviews with 18 women whose race and sexual orientation or identities are shown in the table presented on this slide, alongside their job titles and age. To quote from the article, 12 of the women were white, 3 were Asian, 2 were Black, and 1 was white Latina. 7 women identified as lesbian, bisexual, queer, or pansexual. 11 identified as heterosexual. 17 identified their sex as female, and 1 is non-binary trans, although they chose to identify as a female at work to avoid any confusion. Alfrey and Twine also wanted to note how the term geek has altered in definition and sentiment over time. Previously identified as an insult to those who exemplified intense intellect but lacked acceptable social skills, the rise of the STEM industries has romanticized the term and lifestyle that precedes it. As Alfrey and Twine state, geekness is measured by one's technical skills, but also by specific personality traits, styles of dress, interests, forms of cultural knowledge, and gender presentation. Alfrey and Twine also argue that geek culture symbolizes a type of normative masculinity that is racialized and class-inflected. They break this identity down through their interviews and present it through a few case studies in their article. The first issues they look at is that of the female experience of microaggressions in the workplace. They define microaggressions as subtle, stunning, and often nonverbal exchanges that function as put-downs for a person of a minority status. To better understand how this plays out, the next few slides are going to present the case studies Alfrey and Twine use. The first is Anastasia. Anastasia is 29 years old, white, married, and heterosexual. She's a software developer who wears a black form-fitting t-shirt, black plastic-framed glasses, a wedding ring, and her shoulder-length blonde hair loose. It is important to note that her dress is of extreme significance when interacting with her male teammates, something that presents as a universal sentiment across the study, and which we will explore in detail later in this presentation. She's the only developer on an all-male team, and when asked about the challenges she faced in this role, she responds with the following quote: "I'm reminded every day that I'm the only female developer on my team for sure. I'll be in a meeting and no one makes eye contact with me. They make eye contact with each other. And I know this isn't just in my head. I've talked to other women who have had this issue too. And even in small meetings where it's you and 2 other people, and they, the male developers, are talking to each other about your project. Or one of my male coworkers and I will talk to DevOps to ask questions about something. I'm the one asking the question. The DevOps person turns to my male colleague and explains the answer to him. It is really alienating." Mercedes experienced a similar challenge to Anastasia, but this one negatively impacted her work to a higher degree. Mercedes is 27 years old, white Latina, and earned her master's degree at CMU for computer science. She dressed similarly to Anastasia and was the only woman on a team of white men. When prompted with the same question posed to Anastasia, she answered, "I didn't really care at first being the only woman, that is. But then you start noticing certain stuff. When I make a decision, I get way more questions than the other guys. It took me forever to earn the respect of some of my peers. And I'm kind of always freaking out that I'm going to make a mistake, that everything I've been working on is going to disappear." Because of these microaggressions, Mercedes ended up leaving her team, saying she was tired of dealing with the aggressive behaviors being directed at her simply because she was the only woman on the team, and therefore was assumed to be at fault for any mistakes or inconsistencies. While there's not enough sufficient data to highlight the number of women who leave their positions because of microaggressions, Alfrey and Twine point out that it is true that women leave their jobs in science and engineering at higher rates than men. To further their study, Alfrey and Twine dive into interactions between men and women who identify as bisexual. Much like the study presented on Schilt on female-to-male trans men, they find that bisexual white women experience a similar level of inclusion with their male counterparts. One example of this is Tasha. Tasha is 28 years old, white, bisexual, and female. She wears a similar gender-neutral form of dress as Anastasia and Mercedes, and explained in her interview how she was treated differently when she did conform to feminine dress. She states that she was wearing dresses every day because it's hot and dresses are the hot weather cheat code. And every single meeting when I was introduced as one of the engineers, there was an "oh." One of their engineers just flat out stared at me and said, "Really?" I was dressed up femme, and there was a constant belief when I was introduced to new people at the company. Alfrey and Twine also note that among the women they interviewed, individuality was discouraged in the tech culture, something that Tasha exemplifies. As Tasha's quote elicits, dressing gender neutral allows women to better identify with their male counterparts. Whiteness and heterosexuality, Alfrey and Twine indicate, is a form of neutrality that allows a position of power. Tasha further illuminates this position in the following quote, which is an excerpt from a larger quote presented in the study. "I don't get treated differently because at this point they've absorbed me as male. I don't dress particularly feminine. Like at work, I'm loud, I'm silly, I'm friends with all of these people. I have a very dry, blunt sense of humor, which is very similar to the other guys on my team. It isn't that they think of me not as a woman, it's that they think of me like them." Many scholars identify gender as performance based on these types of reports. Tasha, both white and exhibiting gender-neutral dress and behavior, was exempt from the microaggressions Anastasia and Mercedes experienced because she did not act particularly feminine and therefore was conforming to what the males on her team saw as male identities and was easier to get along with. As indicated in Schultz's study, transgender female-to-male employees experience a greater rate of acceptance because they are perceived as exemplifying male identity. 2 women that Alfrey and Twine interviewed helped to provide more insight on this situation. Samantha, who goes by Sam at work, is a 32-year-old white software engineer who identifies as non-binary trans outside of work, but as female in the office. Like the other women discussed, Sam conformed to the gender-neutral style of dress. Sam decided to identify as a female at work to avoid any confusion among coworkers. She noted that it's less about the biological sexual orientation and more about the performance of masculinity in the male space. "I think it would be difficult for a woman," she notes, "to be very feminine because it's engineering, such a non-feminine space, and part of the subculture is a creation of nerdy masculinity." Being a transgender, Sam found this space to be comfortable as she worked through the transition, something that benefited her in her experience. Similarly, Cameron, a 30-year-old Korean American who identifies as pansexual and gender fluid, found that her ability to, quote, pass as one of the men encouraged her acceptance as a technical writer amongst male colleagues. Noticing that her 2 female coworkers were pushed out of their technical roles for perceived incompetence, Cameron notes, their male coworkers' ineptitude was more acceptable because they were still one of the guys. Unfortunately, there were times where people would ask me a question only for me to see them walk to a male associate and ask them the same question or tell me flat out to my face that men just know more about that kind of stuff. In turn, these type of situations led Cameron to, quote, act more to be one of the guys, to be seen as more competent and valued equally to her male counterparts. Conversely, there are disadvantages for Black women who identify as gender fluid. Unlike Samantha and Cameron's experiences being gender fluid in the workplace, Jasmine, a 28-year-old Black pansexual woman, still experienced the isolation and inferiority placed on her in the STEM industry. Jasmine explained that she was often told to inflate her accomplishments to counteract the disadvantages placed on her because she was Black and biologically female. In a cohort of 30 interns, Jasmine and another Black peer were not only the only women in the cohort, but also the only two people not hired at the conclusion of the internship. Despite her continued efforts and obvious superior performance to her male colleagues, Jasmine expressed that she was continuously evaluated as underperforming. Alfrey and Twine note that, in Jasmine's situation, the men encourage, quote, frat boy practices among each other, which powerfully overdetermine assessments of competence and beliefs about who is a qualified worker. In other words, Jasmine did not conform to her male colleagues' inappropriate behaviors. This, coupled with being the sole Black woman on a white and Asian all-male team, became a concrete barrier that could not be overcome by gender fluidity. Jasmine was never able to be seen as one of the guys, despite her fluidity, and was excluded from informal activities and social gatherings with male coworkers and evaluated as an underperformer by her manager because of her race. Beyond this, she was not mentored or given the opportunity to succeed and was therefore pushed out of her company altogether, making her part of the leaky pipeline previously discussed. Because she was not white or Asian, she was identified as being different from the male coworkers on her team and was therefore treated as such. As they conclude, Alfrey and Twine note that race and sexual orientation co-determine whether a woman is allowed to be treated and accepted as one of the guys in occupational environments where white and Asian men are the dominant group and symbolically represent the ideal employee. Racially privileged and gender fluid women in the study were overall perceived as more competent by their male colleagues because they performed male gender stereotypes through their behaviors and dress. As noted with Jasmine, gender fluid Black women did not reap the same benefits. The cases presented here are just a few interviews conducted by Alfrey and Twine for their study, but illuminate a universal issue surrounding race and gender fluidity. While some women benefit from being white or Asian and gender fluid, therefore performing as the white and Asian males on their team, this encourages the male supremacy already in place. This research also supports the findings from Kristen Schilt in her study on female-to-male transgender men, as well as previous discussions we have had in class surrounding the performance of gender in the workplace.